Okay, so we have looked at evolution. Now we're going to look at the mechanisms of evolution and natural selection. So first we have to understand the genetics at the population scale. So we're looking at the entire population because evolution occurs in a population, so it makes sense. A gene pool is a collection of alleles found in all of the individuals of a population. So you have a population. How many different alleles are there for skin color in the population? So we have three different options. They can be green, they can be purple, or they can be red. So we have three different alleles in the population. Now, allele frequency is looking at the proportion of one allele to another. So how many do you have of each allele? Here you have 12 green, 2 purple, and 1 red. This tells you that the green allele is most often found in the population. Okay, so it's the one that you have the majority of frogs are green. You have less that are purple and even fewer that are red. So what does this have to do with evolution? Evolution happens because of genetic variation in the population. Different numbers of alleles and different amounts of each allele. So, speciation is an evolution of 2 or more species from one ancestral species. So you start with one and you form new species. But how exactly does that happen, and how does our gene pool or our allele frequency change enough to have a new species? So one way that your gene pool can change is through gene flow. So the movement of alleles from one population to another. Here we're thinking migration. So you have this population that are all light gray, homozygous recessive, and this population that are all dark gray, homozygous dominant. And this homozygous dominant dark gray beetle is joining this population. So it migrated into this population and it's bringing its new alleles to this population. Another mechanism is genetic drift. So it's a change in allele frequency due to random chance. In this case, you had green and brown beetles, a chance event happened, and you're left with only brown beetles. So as the population continues to evolve, you only see brown beetles in the population. So genetic drift is random. It's something that wasn't selected for or against with any purpose. It is completely random. One way genetic drift happens that causes something specific is the founder effect. So here you have a small number of organisms that colonize a new area. Excuse me. In this case, on the mainland, you have red ladybugs and yellow ladybugs, and a wind came along and blew only red ladybugs to the island. So now the island only has red ladybugs several populations later because the founders, the initial animals that were on this island were only red beetles. And so you end up with a smaller number of genetic variation, a smaller number of gene pool and your allele frequencies. Now, speciation occurs when organisms can no longer reproduce and create offspring. This can occur because of different types of isolation in the population. So they eventually change enough that they can't breed together. So you have a common ancestor, you have some changes, and eventually they get to the point that they can't breed together. One of these mechanisms is geographic isolation or ecological isolation. The populations live in different locations. So some are on this side of the river, some are on that side of the river, and they can't breed because they don't cross the river. So they physically are not in the same location. So they can't breed together. Temporal isolation is about time. So temporal, think time. Put your T and your T together. So the different populations breed at different times. So they can be right next to each other, but this species is open to breed in May and this species is closed, so they're not going to breed together. You see the same thing with our frogs down here. All these frogs could live in the same pond, but you'll never have a wood frog and a tree frog breeding together and making offspring because the wood frog breeds in April and the tree frog breeds in June. So temporal is time. Behavioral isolation is what it sounds like. Their behavior is different. So here you can have a different song or a different dance. Birds are most often used to show this. So these two birds are actually the same species, but they don't mate together because their songs are different to call a mate to them. And so if you have an eastern meadowlark next to a western meadowlark, they're still not going to breed together. Same thing down here with our boobies, which is a type of bird. You have blue-footed boobies and you have masked boobies, and they perform different rituals, different dances to attract a mate, and so they'll never attract a mate of the other species because it's different. This is kind of a cute representation from the amoeba sisters to show the behavioral isolation difference. The last type of isolation we're going to talk about is mechanical isolation. So the reproductive systems don't fit together. They're in the same area, they're breeding at the same time, they have the same cues to tell each other to breed, but they literally cannot breed together because their reproductive systems don't fit together. Okay? So this is the last type of reproductive isolation that'll lead to a new species. So we've gone through gene pool and allele frequency for your genetics at a population scale. We've looked at gene flow with migration of alleles and genetic drift as a chance event, changing your gene pool or your allele frequencies. And then the 4 types of reproductive isolation that can cause speciation. So we're looking at geographic isolation. They're not in the same location. Temporal isolation, they breed at different times. Behavioral isolation, they have different cues to trigger mating. And mechanism isolation or mechanical isolation, where the reproductive systems do not fit together.